Special thank you to my patrons for both helping make this video happen and providing today's topic.
The 90s were an almost indescribable boon to Floridian college football. On the top, you had all three of Florida's largest brands at or near their peaks of power. Spurrier's Gators, Bowden's Seminoles, and Erickson's Hurricanes, all lighting up the nation, winning 4 national titles and playing for many more across the decade. Beyond Florida's Big Three, however, this boon brought with it the establishment of Florida's mid-majors. After spending more than 2 decades without a mid-major college team, the state of Florida would see the rise of 5 across the 90s and early 2000s. The first would be Central Florida, being promoted to the FBS in 1996. A year before their eventual arch-rivals, South Florida, established their football program, with the Bulls eventually being promoted in 2001. After Orlando and Tampa came Boca Raton and Miami, with FAU and FIU both creating a football program in the early 2000s, and both being promoted in 2004. These 4 schools would fill out Florida's second tier of college football, each spending the decades following their establishment writing the next chapter of Floridian football. In the middle of this renaissance came a 5th mid-major team, a storied Division II program looking to move to college football's highest level of play. The 4 teams before are still with us in Division 1A, but this 5th program is nowhere to be found. The void a byproduct of the catastrophe their move to the FBS ended up being. This is the story of Florida A&M and their disastrous move to the FBS. The Florida A&M Rattlers, before their move to the FBS, were among the most storied football programs in HBCU and Florida football history. Being founded in 1907, the Rattlers would play as an independent until 1926, when they joined the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Conference with fellow HBCUs like Morehouse, Tuskegee, and Tennessee State. It's in the SIAC where they'd win their first black college national title in 1938, the first of an eventual 16, tied with Tennessee State for the most among HBCU programs. They'd spend the first half of the 20th century in the NCAA College Division, essentially Division II, where they'd prove competitive both within and outside of the HBCU sphere, winning an AP College Division national title in 1962 off a 9-1 record. Their year-in and year-out proficiency would eventually lead to their promotion in the newly founded Division I AA, or FCS, in 1978, where they immediately went 10-1 in the regular season, made the inaugural FCS playoffs, and won a Division I AA national title, the first, and as of the 2023 season only, historically black college and university program to do so. The Rattlers, after leaving the SIAC for the Mid-Eastern Athletic Conference in '79 and scoring a win over the Miami Hurricanes, would begin to cool off going into the 80s before storming back into FCS prominence in the 90s, with the hiring of Super Bowl III champion Billy Joe off an NAIA national title winning stint with the Central State Marauders. He'd win his first MEAC title in '95 before bringing the Rattlers back to the playoffs for the first time since they won it all in '78. Billy Joe's Florida A&M would remain a postseason threat for the rest of the 90s, with a deep push in 1999 highlighting his 6-year playoff streak going into 2001, where Florida A&M began dreaming of Division 1A, the summit of college football. In the wake of the Rattlers' dominant 6-year run, the idea of a promotion to the FBS began floating in the minds of A&M's athletic department, particularly in the mind of athletic director Fred Gaines. Taking over in 2002 following the departure of longtime director Frederick Humphreys, Gaines would oversee a Rattler football program he and other members of the Rattler top brass felt was ready to make the move to the FBS. This eventual decision would come down to a number of factors, the clearest of which being the quality of play A&M was producing. It's far from unprecedented for FCS programs with the success the Rattlers had to make the move to Division 1A. Looking at national title winners from '78 to '02, 2 programs, Boise State and Louisiana Monroe, would already be in the FBS, with an additional 4, Georgia Southern, Marshall, UMass, and Western Kentucky, moving up to the highest level of play in the coming decades. Throughout the 90s, they'd even be in the same playoff brackets with a number of these future FBS teams. 98 alone had Georgia Southern, UConn, Troy, UMass, and Appalachian State, all playing alongside Florida A&M. The Rattlers were also, theoretically, in a perfect location, being right beside Florida State in the lucrative recruiting grounds of Florida, the perfect spot for undervalued diamonds in the rough that fly right under Florida State's nose. The community support was also there. HBCUs in general have some of the most active fan bases among the FCS, owing to their rich histories these programs have, attracting crowds that make even some Power 6 programs blush. Beyond these factors, however, was another less objective but far more important reason behind A&M's eventual decision. The Florida A&M Rattlers pride themselves on being HBCU football pioneers. They were the first to win an NCAA-sanctioned national title, being one of only 2 HBCUs to do so. They were the first to win the FCS, and remain the only HBCU to even really get close. They've won more and have been further than all of their peers, and becoming the sole FBS HBCU would be their final step in their multi-decade-long journey to make history. When the decision was finally made in 2003 to move up, the administration would instantly be put on the back foot. The Rattlers' application would be almost immediately approved by the NCAA, but they'd get 0 transition period to get their program in order. They were immediately Division 1A. 2003 would be their last year in the FCS, and they needed to get everything ready in less than a year. And there was plenty to get ready. Their roster, both on the field and on the sidelines, needed to be expanded by a non-insignificant amount, meaning more scholarships and more paychecks needed to be handed out. A&M's home stadium, Bragg Memorial, also needed to be expanded. And in the span of less than a year, with many programs already having their schedules set in stone, Florida A&M needed to find 11 teams to play, including at least 4 home games, all before actually assembling a competitive FBS team. On the competitive team front, Billy Joe would get to work assembling his first FBS roster, landing a number of high-profile transfers to help ease them into Division 1A. The highlight of which being Clemson quarterback Willie Simmons, a senior looking for a fresh start in Tallahassee, a name expected to add legitimacy and recruits to the Rattlers. According to NCAA rules at the time regarding transfers, you could transfer to Division 1A to AA without sitting a year, meaning Simmons would be able to transfer in and start immediately. There was one problem, however. Florida A&M was no longer Division 1 AA. They were already, legally speaking, in the FBS, meaning Simmons would have to sit, something the senior quarterback could not do. After receiving the news, he'd frantically transfer again to the Citadel. One more transfer would follow him out of Tallahassee, and the Rattlers ringman was already out before the season even began. It'd only get worse. Naming rights for the stadium, a move to try to balance the budget A&M desperately needed to be out of the red, would fall through. So would their television contract. They were bleeding money by the day with no end in sight, and the stadium renovations never got off the ground. Worse still, of the 11 games they scheduled for their inaugural FBS season, only 6 actually came from the FBS, and only 1 would be willing to make the trip to Tallahassee. In racing to meet the strict 2004 deadline, Florida A&M achieved none of their goals, being thrust into the FBS broke, depleted, and unprepared. The stage was set for a disaster of biblical proportions, a disaster that began on September 4th, 2004 in Champaign, Illinois. The season would begin with a 13-52 blowout to Illinois, a result made even worse by how Illinois looked to the rest of the season. They'd go 3-8 on the year, averaged 21.8 points per game, 338.1 yards per game, and 1.7 interceptions per game on offense. But against the fledgling Rattlers, they'd look exactly like Pete Carroll's USC, scoring just 12 less points in this game alone than they'd score throughout the entire month of October. A bad Power 6 team is still Power 6, though. It was an expected loss. What was a little more concerning was a 20-point loss to an eventual 5-6 Tulane in front of a mostly empty New Orleans Superdome, elevating yet another struggling offense to one of their season-best performances. Then they'd lose 38-7 to an abysmal 2-9 Temple Owls in their best performance of the year by a mile. Thankfully for Florida A&M, they'd get a few FCS teams to fill out their bare-bones schedule, where they'd only win 3 of 5, beating Tennessee State, Virginia Union, and Savannah State, and dropping games to Nicholls State and cross-state rival Bethune-Cookman. In between these uninspiring performances against teams supposedly a subdivision below them, the Rattlers would take a 0-62 evisceration at the hands of an eventual top 10 Virginia Tech, before playing the state of Florida's 2 other youngest programs, Florida Atlantic and Florida International, promptly getting blown out by both. Neither were especially great. FAU would finish with a deceptive 9-3 record that included 4 FCS wins and a 3-3 conference record, and FIU would finish a short 10-game season that included 5 FCS teams of their own with a horrific 3-7 record, but it simply didn't matter. Peek under the hood and the situation becomes even worse, scoring 11.67 points per game and giving up 44.83 points per game against the FBS, going 2-8 on field goals, all against, outside of Virginia Tech and FAU, fundamentally broken teams. It was clear by the end of the year that Florida A&M was one of the worst teams in the nation. Advanced metrics, such as this formula from Secret Base's Bill Connolly, have them as the worst team in the nation, even beating out the winless 2004 Central Florida Knights. It's a conclusion my homebrewed formula agrees with, putting the 2004 Rattlers in the same conversation as some of the worst teams of the 21st century, in large part due to the soft schedule they lost this hard to. As this disaster of a season unfolded on the field, another disaster would strike off the field. The athletics budget was deep in the red, and the rest of the university was beginning to feel it. Florida A&M could not gamble its very survival on Division 1A, and 5 games into the 2004 season, the plug was pulled. The Rattlers rejoined the MEAC and the FCS in 2005. The experiment was over, and the fallout had just begun. Fred Gaines was first on the chopping block, as both the largest proponent of the Rattlers' move up and the face of an athletic department on fire. It was clear his time as athletic director was going to come to an abrupt end. In August of 2005, after a, quote, heated meeting, the Florida A&M Board of Trustees voted 9-4 to fire Fred Gaines. On top of the failed move to the FBS and general financial mismanagement, the board would also point to nearly 200 separate NCAA violations regarding eligibility rules. They were mostly minor accounting errors, but it was enough for the MEAC to strip a number of conference titles from the Rattlers, issue a 6-figure fine to the already financially stripped athletic department, and a reduction of scholarships. These violations, beyond further tarnishing Gaines' tenure, would put head coach Billy Joe in the administration's crosshairs. The NCAA would clarify that Billy Joe was not involved in any of these infractions, but it didn't matter to an administration that, by then, did not really care for Joe, who'd be unceremoniously fired by the interim athletic director. Florida A&M had wiped the slate clean, but it'd take years for the Rattlers to fully recover. It'd take until 2010 for the Rattlers to take home another conference title, 9 years after Billy Joe's last in 2001. It'd be an additional 9 years for Florida A&M to take home another Black College national title, and another 2 years for the Rattlers to finally return to the FCS playoffs. With the chaos that was the 2004 Florida A&M promotion to Division 1A now in the rear view, the only question left is how it possibly could have worked. The product A&M put onto the field was rough, but it was far from the deciding factor. After all, FIU went a collective 9-36 in their first 4 years of FBS play, after failing to ever get above 500 in the FCS, and yet they're still kicking today. The problem lies partially in execution and timing. Florida A&M needed years to get everything together, to get funds collected, recruits in uniform, coaches on the sideline, new seats in Bragg Memorial. It simply couldn't have all been done in 10 months. Then there's the schedule. There's a reason the NCAA now requires new programs to join a conference before promotion. It helps the schedule-making process immensely to have 8-ish conference games to lean on. Trying to schedule an independent schedule, again in the span of 10 months, is a Sisyphean task. And it wasn't just football either. Florida A&M was going to go independent in every single sport, something no other university has even tried to do in the modern era. Even Notre Dame has joined a number of different conferences for a number of different sports to help ease the schedule building process. That being said, all of these factors working against the Rattlers paled in comparison to the biggest reason Florida A&M's jump to Division 1A was doomed from the start: a lack of funds. The university was already suffering from an unhealthy budget, even back in the 90s, and the move turned that budget concern into a budget nightmare, threatening the very survival of Rattler athletics. It's an issue that would have struck regardless of the time A&M had to prepare, even if Bragg Stadium's naming rights sold, or if the television deal went through, and likely even if they managed to attract a conference. It was a ticking time bomb, one whose wires, unfortunately, could not be snipped. In the long years after the disaster that was their attempted move, Florida A&M is finally back on their feet, playing the games they largely always had, in a subdivision of football they've always been comfortable in. Even if there is some reality where Florida A&M's move to the FBS was successful, what would it be for? To play in the shadow of Florida State? To slowly lose each and every notable series and rivalry the program has had for decades to play UAB or Southern Mississippi? Florida A&M is, to this day, one of the HBCU's most prestigious programs, and while their dreams of the FBS did eventually fall through, the legacy remains, stronger than ever.
I'd like to, again, thank my patrons: William L. Jagnow, Aiden Wong, Yeah Avenue, Ryan Liu, Authentic Sims, Max Kern, Joe Sports 2022, Lance Justice, Class Jackson Lawsuit, Hoppe, October Rust 02, Justin Pedraza, Nick Knudsen, Lurker, Trash Can Gus, Sock'em Boppers, Ease.L, Spicy Bape, The Erupturotan, Adrian Genge, Deatheros, Sean McWilliams, CC, The Hidden Source, Bradley Moore, at Signwood, Scarface1, Lamb, Mega Doomer, Phillip, and Crosley Jones. And lastly, I want to thank my writing buddy and the best cat I could have ever asked for, Cedric, who unfortunately passed away during the making of this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see all of y'all in the next video.